talking to myself. So I'll just start again. Thanks for letting me know that you couldn't hear me. So my name is Maura, and I'm Ian's partner, and I was just quickly introducing myself. I'm an ILCA 6 sailor on the Canadian national team since 2018, and I'm also a doctorand, a PhD student here at Stockholms University in meteorology. But I do want to add the caveat that specifically weather forecasting is not my scientific area of expertise. I'm just enthusiast and sailor, so by no means the biggest expert, I would say, but hopefully I have some useful information for you tonight. Okay, so here we go. My plan for today is to start at the large scale, talking generally about weather sort of basics, what we can look at in terms of forecasts and different types of wind, and how those will impact a typical race course for a dinghy sailor. And then I'm going to focus in on to how those different kind of conditions can impact our planning and our decision making for a race, for a day, and for hopefully specifically in the race. So we kind of will start big and zoom in to the race course. So I've divided it kind of into two parts. The first part, things we can think about before the regatta, before we even get to a particular venue. And that's things like just some weather basics, the common types of wind that we might see at a dinghy venue, how to get venue statistics, and then we'll have a short break because this is, I think, is planned to be a fairly long session. And then the second part will be what we can do at the venue or in the morning of a race in terms of strategic planning, what to look for when we're on the water warming up, deciding about our starts and that kind of thing. And I want to point out that these slides and all my notes that I have with them, I'll make them available as a PDF and share that with Ian, and he can email that out to everyone. So if it feels a little hectic to take notes, or there seems to be a lot of writing on a slide, don't worry about that. You will get them afterwards. Okay, so first off, before we even get to a regatta, what can we learn while we're just sitting at home? And there's actually a huge amount that we can learn about a place before we even get there. The first thing I'm going to go through is sort of just basic information about different types of wind we might encounter. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of the shore or the coastline, because that's quite important for the places that we sail. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about topography and like how this applies to lakes versus seashore and the effects of mountains and things like that. Okay, so on a large global scale, the winds that sort of move around the atmosphere are generally caused by differences in pressure. And we call these differences a gradient in pressure. In English, a gradient means a change in something. And so the air wants to balance out these differences in pressures. So it's not natural to have sort of high and low pressure next to each other. Ideally, we would want these to all balance out. And so the air flows in such a way that it tries to balance out the highs and low pressures that are all across the atmosphere. And the wind that results from this change in pressure that it's trying to balance is called the gradient wind. And you can think of the gradient wind as the sort of larger scale winds you might see if you zoom out on a weather map, maybe on your app or something, and you look at like the whole continent or a very large region. These are kind of the gradient winds. So like I said, they're dictated by the pressure in the atmosphere. So we can have high pressure systems. And this is where we have a lot of descending air. So air is coming down, the atmosphere is very thick. So downward with a lot of pressure is high pressure. And these are typically associated with clear skies, and calm conditions. Sort of a typical calm summer day might be a high pressure day. And then in contrast, we have low pressure systems. So this is where we have rising and diverging air, meaning air is going away. So there's less air, there's low pressure. And these are associated with like rain and storms and fronts. So we see a lot more low pressure systems in the winter times, and we see a lot more weather associated with low pressures. And then we have things called fronts. And this is the term for the boundary between different air masses. They're typically associated with low pressure systems, and they can sort of cause sudden changes in weather from cloudy to sunny or sunny to cloudy and rainy, vice versa. Oh, hello. There we go. Okay, so this is what we might see if we open up our weather app and we take a zoomed out look. So there's a lot going on in this picture, but if you can see the black lines, those are all the outlines of the land. So right in the center is Sweden, just to the left of that big H. And then we have a large part of northern of Europe, northern Asia, and a bit of America, North America. And so this is just a screenshot from windy.com, which is a pretty typical place that you can get your forecast information from. And this just really nicely illustrates these kind of high and low pressure systems that I was talking about. So there's a large high pressure system just over sort of like Eastern Europe, and there's a large low pressure system in the North Atlantic. And in the Northern Hemisphere, the winds tend to flow, or always flow, clockwise around high pressures and anti-clockwise around low pressures. And so we get these kind of meandering paths around the different pressure systems. So in this picture, right in the middle here, we're going to have winds that are flowing from south to north, like this. And even though we think of gradient wind as trying to even out these high and low pressure systems, you can imagine like if you had water, some sort of piled up for some reason on the side of a tank, it wants to flow back so that everything is even. This is sort of what the air wants to do as well. It wants to flow from high to low. But because we're on around planet that's rotating, there's not just this pressure difference force, there's also some additional forces because of rotation, basically. So we actually have the wind flowing parallel and around these pressure systems rather than from high to low. And so they go parallel to these white lines. These are called isobars. They're lines of constant pressure. So in this picture, because we have clockwise around high pressure and counterclockwise around low pressure, we have wind following along the isobars from south to north. The other thing we can tell from these kind of pictures is how strong the gradient wind will be. So when those white lines are very close together, that means that there's a large difference in strong difference in pressure in that region, and there'll be stronger winds. So you can see probably around this low in the North Atlantic, it's really windy. It's probably stormy and cold out there. Okay, so another thing we can see when we look at these large scale weather maps are fronts. So now in this picture, we've zoomed in a little bit over top of Sweden and Norway, and we have a low pressure up in the north. And we've got a couple of different frontal lines. And these will always have the same kind of drawing or picture, no matter what weather map you look at. So a front is just the boundary between two different air masses, and it's usually a cold and a warm air mass. And the front is basically defined by which air mass is moving into the region. So a warm front is a warm air mass moving over colder air. A cold front is cold air moving in over warmer. And then this sort of funny word, occluded front, is a combination of the two. It's basically a cold front that has run into a warm front. And these are basically always associated with low pressure systems. So when we have a lot of weather moving in, and a lot of this weather coming in is actually driven by these fronts. So a warm front, like I said, is warm air slowly moving in and replacing cold air. Warm fronts typically move fairly slowly, and they're characterized by low, thick sort of stratiform, we call it, low, thick clouds before the front, maybe even fog and some rain, and then a clear and warm skies afterwards. So very often if you see these kind of fronts when you're sailing, it's a very distinct line from cloudy and rainy to clear skies and warm breeze. Conversely, a cold front is cold air replacing warmer air, and these tend to move quite quickly. And they're what we call a squall line. So these are characterized by like a row of thunderstorms, big mixing air, clouds, lots of rains, and it's often very gusty, and you often have a lot of mixing. So you have puffs coming down from high up in the atmosphere. And because the cold front is typically behind a warm front and is moving faster, when it catches up, then you get these occluded fronts, which are sort of an overtaking mixture of the two. And that can be basically any kind of weather. So it could be stormy, you could have puffy winds, lots and lots of different things can go on. There we go. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I think I've heard you say that before, that there's literally bumps, like hills and valleys in the high and low pressure system in the air, in like the top of the atmosphere. I just wanted to check.
Yeah.
Fact check.
Yeah, exactly. So a high pressure is like literally more
thicker atmosphere.
Yeah, more atmosphere, and a low pressure is typically less. And that's because of you can think of it, it's the pressure at the surface, and a high pressure has generally air coming down. So it's pushing down onto the surface, creating high pressure. Whereas a low pressure at the surface is typically air moving away and up. So it's low pressure because it's not pushing down at the surface. Kind of a good way to think about it. So it's simultaneously what's happening vertically in the atmosphere, but also what's happening north to south is very important. So you typically see these rows of high and low pressure, like across from west to east. And then the gradient wind, the sort of large scale wind, will kind of meander around them. Like I said, clockwise around low highs and counterclockwise around lows. So this is the large scale wind. When we're looking at our weather map, this is like the first thing we're going to look for. Are there distinct high and low pressure systems? And are there these tightly packed lines, these isobars? I will sort of like review the decision-making process when you look at a forecast at the end. But if that's not the case, if perhaps you open up your weather app and it's like, oh, there's just a big high sitting on top of us, nothing is supposed to happen, or those pressure lines are spread very far apart and there's not really strong gradient wind, then we're going to start looking for more local effects to drive the wind we're racing in. And that's things like a thermal sea breeze. So the term sea breeze is typically used to refer to this thermally driven circulation, but it's a bit misleading because some people call any wind that comes from the water direction a sea breeze. And that could be either gradient, like driven by these large scale pressures, or it could be this thermal wind. So I'm going to try to use the phrase thermal sea breeze to describe this local circulation. And this is typically caused by the differences in temperature between water and land. So in the daytime, the sun heats the land, and then the land heats the air above it, and that air rises because warm things are more buoyant. And as it rises, you can think of like there's an excess of it's pushing the air at the top. And so that air has to go somewhere, and it will go out over the water, which is sort of helped along, especially if we have a gradient wind already in that direction, flowing out over the sea. And simultaneously, because the water is a bit cooler, we can have air descending or going down over the sea. And so this rising on one side and going down on the other side creates this closed loop. And on the surface, we have a sea breeze. And this is a pretty well-defined wind phenomenon. So there's some really great things we can look for on a day to figure out if it's going to be a nice thermal sea breeze day or not. And so here I've given like the steps for a perfect sea breeze. A lot of the time we might have other complicating factors, but in an ideal world or a venue that's very good for sea breezes, this is what we would see. So the morning, you want it to either be calm, no wind, or some nice offshore gradient. So actually offshore wind very early in the morning that then starts to die is good for sea breeze development. And you want mostly a clear sky, so not too cloudy. Maybe a little bit of haze over the ocean is fine. Then you also need somewhere where the land and water temperature difference is going to be at least about 5 degrees Celsius. So somewhere where the land is going to warm up quite a bit during the day, but the sea or the ocean or the water is relatively cool. And then in the morning, you're going to start to want to look for this low cloud that over the water begins to disappear. So that starts to clear out. And simultaneously, a little bit of wind starts to develop close to shore. As the sea breeze builds, this circulation is first going to be very localized, and it's going to get wider and wider. So as the sea breeze builds, it'll extend out both inland and towards the sea. And then at this point, you might also start to see these characteristic puffy clouds develop on land. We often call them maybe popcorn clouds or something like that, little tiny fluffy clouds. Those develop where the air is rising, where it's heating on shore. And then as the sea breeze builds, in the Northern Hemisphere, it will typically turn towards the right, quite aggressively, actually. So it starts out almost perpendicular to the shore, and then can turn almost 40 degrees in the first hour as it builds. And the eventual direction will be not directly on shore, but actually at a bit of an angle off the shore. And these breezes typically peak in sort of the mid-afternoon. So this is a diagram that shows you kind of this directional change throughout the day of this ideal sea breeze. So you can actually get the opposite circulation. You get a little land breeze at night, and then a sea breeze during the day. And so the key thing to take away from this is that as the sea breeze builds, it turns to the right, and then it's strongest in the mid-afternoon at this sort of 30-degree angle off from the shore. So if you're at a place like Villamoura sometimes gets nice sea breezes, for example, nice thermal, you can pretty much bank on this kind of behavior. So a building and turning right and hitting the maximum somewhere around mid-afternoon. Now that's for a perfect sea breeze. So obviously we often have complicating factors, one of which is that there could be some gradient wind, so it can be not completely calm. And that can do a few things. Sometimes you can have a gradient direction that is good for the sea breeze, but sometimes it can also suppress it, depending on the direction. So like I said earlier, if the gradient or like the large scale wind is the same direction that the wind on the top of the sea breeze loop is going, this is great because it helps the air high up flow out over the sea and encourages this divergence near shore or the sort of the air going down and flowing in that we need for the sea breeze. And so you can see this little diagram right at the bottom. The gradient wind is flowing over the land and over the sea, and there's a calm area near the shore. And then this, as the sea breeze begins to develop, it develops first close to the shore, and then extends outwards away from shore. And this kind of gradient direction can really help a sea breeze be really strong. And this is when we get those like nice 20-knot sea breezes that really appear like clockwork in some venues. But we can actually also have offshore gradient that's not good for a sea breeze. And this is because it encourages convergence near the shore. So it kind of suppresses this downwelling part of the loop. So you might have air rising over the land because it's hot, but the atmosphere is really struggling to replace it with the air coming down. And as a result, you can have these sort of bands of calm patches that develop, or a sea breeze occurring not right next to shore, but actually developing offshore. This does happen quite a lot of venues where you think it's going to be a typical sea breeze day, but then instead of the sea breeze coming in right by the beach, it comes in a bit offshore, and then it builds and retreats as the day goes by instead of this sort of steady clockwork. And that's typically because we have this kind of gradient more from the right looking at the shore than the left. So if we look at the forecast first thing in the morning and we have a look at what the gradient direction kind of will be, this can give us a really good idea if this is going to be a good thermal development day or a struggling thermal development day.
The size of these, like how far are we talking, a couple kilometers or many kilometers or a few hundred meters for the calm patch that precedes?
Yeah, this can be anywhere from a few hundred meters to maybe a kilometer, but not more. So typical sea breezes are pretty localized things. They will only extend for maybe a few kilometers off the shore, even in perfect conditions. And sort of the other atmospheric considerations can maybe make that smaller or bigger. But this could be something you easily observe. So it's not going to be like a calm patch that's miles offshore. That's not, this would be something that's very relevant to us dinghy sailors. So a day where, you know, everyone's talking about how they expected a thermal to come in or expected a sea breeze, but it's been pretty difficult to maybe set the race course in a typical place close to shore, or you see a lot of conflicting sometimes the sea breeze is in, sometimes it's out. These kind of days is typically because of this kind of gradient. And then finally, of course, we can also have gradient that comes from the same direction as a sea breeze. But like I said, when I first started, there's quite a difference between a thermal sea breeze and a gradient that comes from the ocean. And it's kind of important for us to know which is which when we're making our strategic planning. So this is why it's a good idea to take a look at the forecast and try to understand, is this a gradient driven or is this a thermal driven sea breeze? Okay, so now we've basically talked about like two major driving wind types that we could see in a dinghy venue. So we talked about gradient wind and we talked about thermals. And now I want to talk about the other important thing for dinghy venues, which is that we are racing close to shore. So we're either racing in a coastal venue or on a lake, but in all the cases, we're not going to be going too far away from land. And so the land is going to have a big effect on the wind. The most important thing to know is the direction of the wind relative to the shoreline. And this is because there's a big difference in friction between the land surface and the water surface. And the wind is really affected by that friction. So more friction causes a wind to slow down. And because we have this addition of the rotation of the planet, when the wind slows down, it turns left in the northern hemisphere. So there is both a difference vertically in the wind bend. So there's more slowing down and more bend on land because of more friction. compared with the wind aloft, but there's also a wind bend as you move from land to water because of the difference in friction. So more bend over more friction over the land and less bend over the sea. The result of that is that there's going to be differences in the surface wind on the shoreline. So we need to know the direction. And basically you can divide up your shoreline into sort of 4 quadrants, and we'll just go through what each of those means. So if it comes from this first quadrant, basically it comes directly offshore. We're going to have a left shift as you approach the shore, and that bend is going to be stronger in the lulls. And that left shift is because, like I said, the wind bends more over the land than does over the water. So over the land, it's more left than over the water. And this is basically a permanent feature. So if you have offshore wind, there's always going to be more left in it the closer you get to shore. This is also the case if the shore is on your left-hand side. So now instead of sailing upwind directly towards the shore, we're now sailing upwind along the shore with the land on our left. And because of this difference in bend, there's going to be convergence at the shore. And convergence just means that the wind is adding together. So the wind on the shore and the wind direction on the water are going to come together and create this band of stronger wind close to the shore. And this is why there's sort of like a phrase that we often use, which is land on the left, go left. And that's because you'll get this consistently stronger wind close to shore, and also a little bit of a left shift closer to shore. Now the opposite, and by the way, this is all for the Northern Hemisphere. So if you ever happen to be sailing in Australia, you got to flip in your mind, which is a bit tricky. So the opposite case is true for if the shore is on the right. This we'll call divergence, or the wind that flows along the water and flows along the land. They'll want to go away from each other, so they'll sort of subtract, and so there'll be lighter wind near shore. So basically, if there's land on the right, maybe don't go near there, but it's certainly not influencing. It's certainly not going to be an advantage or influencing us just because there's land there. And finally, of course, wind that blows from the sea is not going to bend when because of the land. We're not going to see any wind bend on our race course from onshore wind. But there is the caveat that this thermal development, you will see a persistent right shift in a thermal. That's not because of friction bend, it's just because of how the thermal develops. Okay, we're doing well with time. So I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about lakes, because we also do some lake sailing in ILCA. And basically lakes can be a combination of all of these shore effects. So small lakes can have all the coastal effects together because you're basically close to a shore on all sides. And this means that you can have this left bend as you go upwind, as well as this stronger wind on the left and the lighter wind on the right, all happening simultaneously. Or you can have on a very large lake, you'll basically can treat that as a normal coastline, and you'll have the effects considered separately. So it just depends on the direction that you have relative to the shoreline. Another cool thing is that you can get a lake breeze, which is like a thermal sea breeze, where you have this circulation happening, but on all sides of the lake. So the air is going to be coming down in the center of the lake and then flowing outwards towards the shore, basically in every direction. So if you're on a big lake and this is your race course is sort of just has one shore side, this is fine. But if you're on a small lake, this can be quite funny because basically the wind is always coming from the middle of the lake. Although this is not typically a very strong breeze, so it's very hard for it to recycle this circulation. So you might get like wind developing and then dying, developing and then dying as it tries to build this circulation. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of land effects is mountains. So if we're somewhere like that has some fjords, for example, a bay with mountains on one side, or even a mountainous coastline, then we can have sort of funneling effects of the wind. And that basically means that it's very difficult for the air to lift up and over the mountains. It really normally doesn't want to do that. It wants to follow the path of least resistance. So it'll tend to go down valleys or flow along mountain slopes. And this is one example I've given where if you have a mountain range along a coastline, this actually happens quite a lot in the winter on the west coast of North America, where there are mountains relatively close to the sea. You can get a low pressure system that comes in from the sea and gets kind of stuck up against the mountain range because the air doesn't want to lift over. And so you can get these, they're called a low level jet that's been
You lift your hands up a little bit.
Yeah, it's called a low level jet. So it's basically like a jet of air that is being trapped by this mountain range. And you can get these very strong southerlies, for example, on a west coast range of mountains. You can also get sort of funneling that'll happen with fjords. So if you have mountains on either side of either a lake or a fjord, the air will cool, fall down the mountains, and then funnel down them. So you can think of mountains as kind of having this like guiding effect on the wind direction. Okay, so this is the first half of the talk, and hopefully now you have a bit of an idea of how to answer these kind of questions. So what type of wind do we expect? If we look at our forecast, we want to know, is it gradient wind? Is it going to be thermal wind? And what direction is it going to come from? And then we can also hopefully answer the question, how will the coastline at the venue then affect this wind? If we know the direction and the type. So we might get some wind bend, we might get some convergence, we might get some divergence. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to take these decisions and show you how you can build that into your sort of strategic planning for the day. So once you've decided on the type of wind and the type of day, you don't have to worry about all the other possibilities, and you can make some sort of smart choices for setting up your race. So I think now is a great time if you have any questions about the first part. And if not, I think we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes so you can get some water or whatever you like.
Let's just give people a few seconds to unmute their mic and decide that they want to ask a question, because sometimes that opportunity comes and goes really fast.
Yeah, I won't go anywhere during the break, so feel free to ask any questions, or I'll just start the slides again in 10 minutes.
Regarding Anders asking here, regarding the lake, how big lakes are is there where we can find this phenomenon, these winds and thermal effects? I mean, I'm thinking about the lake we have outside here in Mälarhöjden. It's rather small. Could you hear me?
Maybe they can't. Ian, Maura? Wait.
Hey, yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
We had a question.
Yeah, my question was about the size of the lake where you can find the thermal effects. And I'm thinking about the small lake we have here in Mälarhöjden. Is it possible to have those effects here?
I don't think so. but the reason I don't think so is because it is Malahöjden is a bit small, but also because the time of year when the land is warm enough to like have some more of this thermal rising, the water is also relatively warm. Like in August, the Malahöjden water is swimmable, you know, it's really nice. But that means that there isn't a big difference between the temperature difference between the water and the land. And that's a really important part to drive the circulation. So you kind of need the water to stay somewhere where the water stays cold when the land is warm. I think also because there's not a lot of like the sort of Olsten bit of land isn't very large before you get to the next bit of water, like the kind of like lake system around Stockholm. I think we'll have too many temperature sort of like too much cold areas and not enough land heating to get a thermal. So I would say you probably don't get thermal winds on Malahöjden, at least not very often.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. You do get possibly an interesting, now this is, yeah, anyway, you might get a quite interesting like sort of local wind in the summertime. In the evenings, you can get like they might be a sea breeze direction or come from the water, but it's not a thermal wind because it's evening time. That's just caused by the cooling of the boundary layer in the summer. So this happens sometimes, like it can happen in like little bays and lakes and areas where during the daytime you get this like thick, warm bit of air near the surface, but at night when the surface starts to cool, you can get that cooling then can start some mixing in the boundary layer, like just the sort of small area of the atmosphere. And you can get these little like sort of evening breezes that maybe last for an hour or two, kind of perfect for Wednesday night racing. And this is not a thermal breeze. This is just caused by like some increased mixing in the sort of local atmosphere. So that can be a nice like little breeze that you get in these sort of small lake regions or small bays or something like that. So that's not something that you would see on a weather forecast though, for example. It's way too small scale for even a local model to pick up.
Sorry, Anders, continue.
No, I was actually just gonna ask how many knots. Like, are we talking just 2 or 3 knots? Or...
Well, yeah, like maybe 5 knots,
5 knots.
not
Okay.
too windy.
Yeah, I had a question about the mountains, because I guess that this is quite high mountains. Like if you just have a hill or something, I guess these weather are too big to be in, like a hill would influence it. But like, how would you think about like a hill and like how close to land? Like, does the wind in general go over a hill, or does it also try to go around it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The sort of big jet type wind that I was talking about is and in the fjords as well. This is more large scale mountains. But you can definitely have a little bit of impact by even a small hill. It'll just be relatively smaller impact. So in general, you can think of it as depending on the strength of the wind. So when the wind is strong, like it's blowing quite a lot, it's easier for it to go over some obstacle. So in that case, it might be able to come over the hill, but it'll still also come around. But if it's lighter wind or weaker, it'll be more of a struggle for it to come over something like a hill. And so in that case, you would have the wind more being bent around it. And the other effect that you might have if it's struggling to come over the top is that it will only come over the top sort of every once in a while. So you could get like puffs or things that come down off of a hill.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So this kind of thing could be, and this is also then going to be quite tricky to predict, because sometimes there'll be a lull behind that hill, so it'll be blocking the wind, but then every once in a while it'll be strong enough to come over and you could get a puff. And because it's also coming from higher, it's generally the wind is stronger higher up in the atmosphere. So if you have wind that's coming from higher up, it will also be often stronger. So these puffs might come with a little bit of extra pressure if they come down over the top.
And further right? Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Like if it's offshore, maybe a little, yeah. So, oh yeah. So this is a good point. Ian says, wind that comes from higher in the atmosphere will be more from the right. So like I talked about, the friction at the surface causes wind to turn left. And so that means that higher up in the atmosphere, the wind is going to be a little bit more from the right than it is where we are. But if you have something that causes wind to mix downwards, so you get a puff that comes from above, that puff can often have more right shift in it.
Okay.
And so that could be caused by, yeah, some kind of like topography, like a hill or something mixing wind down, but it can also be caused if you have a very turbulent atmosphere. So like a lot of mixing happening, like in a front, for example, the air that mixes down will often have quite a right shift to it in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is all Northern Hemisphere. And I think that when you're sailing, that's the difference between like a puff, when you look up wind and you see like a dark patch approaching for some time, that's more like the surface wind pressure differences. But these puffs from up high, they tend to come down like little splots and kind of spread out as they hit the surface of the water. And so those are the ones that might have a bit more right shift to them than just like a pressure line, which could come from either side, if that makes sense.
It does. Thanks.
Nice. You're welcome. What do you think? Can we go again? Okay, I have it's been about 10 minutes on my watch, so I'll just get started again. I wish I could see myself so I know my hands are there. There we go. Hold on. Nice. Okay, so now we have an idea of sort of like how the wind behaves a little bit generally and what the coastline is like near a venue. And so there we go. Now I want to talk about what considerations do we have on race day. So this is a little bit more real time. And I want to basically give you the impression that the more you can learn about the type of weather you have for a day, the more you can make some of your strategy and decision making ahead of time. And then that frees up your mind to think about all the other things that are going on in a sailboat race. So if you have looked at the weather forecast and you understand what kind of day it is, and you understand the priorities based on that kind of day, then when you get on the water, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can start thinking about the specifics of that race. So like the tactics and the other boats and what's going on without, being confused by the weather, because you've already thought about that. So the idea is to make as many decisions ahead of time as possible, and then simplify what we have to think about when we're sailing, because there's too many things to think about. Oh, my battery's dying. Can I move? Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna start out with asking about what type of day it is. So by that I mean, what type of wind are we looking at? And how does that affect then our priorities and our strategy? And then a little bit, if we have time, about how like the boat on boat tactics. Okay, so by the type of day, I mean the type of wind, the direction, and then what that means for our racing. So it's both specific to the venue and the type of weather we're going to have. And we can know this sort of like the morning of. So this is the type of thing that you would decide as you're having breakfast and you look at the weather forecast before you even get to on the water. So this is kind of the decision tree or the decision-making process that I go through. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out the wind type. So I'm going to look at my big map of weather, and I'm going to look and see if there are these nice distinct high and low pressures, the dense isobars, those pressure lines. And if that's the case, right over top of my venue, I'm going to go, great, I think it's going to be a gradient wind, and that wind is coming from the southwest. Perfect. If it's not, if there's a high pressure over top of it, our venue, or there's weak sort of pressure gradient, those lines are very far apart, it's not really clear, there's not a really good sort of systematic layout of the wind, then I don't think there's going to be a large gradient effect. So then I have to start thinking about, are the conditions good for like a local effect, something like a thermal sea breeze? So then I start looking at, okay, what's the forecasted temperature for the middle of the day on land? What's the sea temperature? Does that look like it's going to be good for a thermal? And then when I've decided on the type of wind, I'm going to look at, okay, where does that wind angle converge on the shoreline? Then I can know if it's going to be an offshore breeze or it's going to be an onshore sea breeze. And then I know if I'm looking for a bend or not. So once I've made those decisions, then I can think about my strategy accordingly. So the first day I'm going to talk about is an onshore gradient wind day. So this is sort of large scale pressure systems are driving the wind. And the most important thing for onshore days are that they're all about boat speed. So the wind is coming from open water typically. And so it's not encountering a lot of obstacles. It's not being driven by small scale things. So it's going to be pretty steady, meaning that there's not going to be a lot of strange shifts. So I need to be able to go fast. And if it's coming from this direction, a good question is always to ask yourself, is it, how do we know it's not a thermal sea breeze? So I put a couple of hints here. If it's a very cloudy day, it's not a good day for a thermal. If there's steady onshore breeze throughout the night and day, so you don't have this building of a thermal, it's just windy the whole time. Or if you look at your weather map and it's being driven by these large scale systems, then we know it's a gradient onshore. It can have sort of long, inconsistent shifts. And those can maybe come with clouds or slight different changes in sort of what the weather looks like. So those are good things to look for. But the main point is that if I wake up and I think it's going to be this kind of day, I know that this day is all about boat speed and about getting to the edges of the course. If it's an onshore breeze, but it's a thermal, then again, it's still a boat speed day because it's an onshore direction. But I now know there's going to be a consistent change in the direction as the day goes on. So I know the wind is going to build throughout the day and swing to the right. So I can make my strategy accordingly. I probably don't want to be banging the left-hand corner every single race. So again, I know that I need to go fast, but now I know that I have to get to this persistent right shift. A thermal sort of sea breeze day is also, it's usually typically stronger wind close to shore. So that can also help my strategic decision making. I want to go where there's more pressure towards more wind. So that's going to be also towards the shore. And finally, we have the opposite, an offshore day. So regardless of the direction, whether it's directly offshore or a bit more from side to side, offshore days are typically more shifty and therefore tactical days. So a question I want to be asking myself is there an angle between the shore and the wind direction? So if it's directly offshore, you're going to have this sort of left bend as you get on shore, but it's also going to be quite shifty, especially if you're sailing somewhere like Ulven or even Malahöjden, where there's buildings and hills and lots of things in the way that the wind has to come over as it's coming down to the water. Those can cause a lot of puffs and shifts. So yes, you're going to have this strengthening and left shift as you get towards the shore, but you also have to think about that there could be other shifts and other things impacting it as it comes off the shore. And then there's also this convergence effect. If the shore is on the left, it's going to be strong wind on the left. If the shore is on the right, could be a lull there, maybe not. So the key for these kind of days is that you're typically working your way either to a ley line or to a persistent feature, this persistent left shift, for example. And how you're getting there depends on linking the shifts and the puffs and being tactical about your racing. So this kind of day is less about boat speed and more about being heads up. So now I know my strategy, like my sort of overarching style of sailing for the day based on the wind. And then I can pick my priority. So I will make the caveat that this is, for me personally, how I set up my race days. And I think it's a nice way to sort of make your decisions as simple as possible. But, you know, you might have other ways of thinking about it, but how I think about it is in terms of priority. And so by priority, I mean, like, what's the most important thing on the race course for me to think about in terms of like the whole race course and the strategy. So for example, I put here, it's a gradient wind, so it's onshore. I know that that's then a boat speed day on the edges, sailing fast. And then I know, because the most important thing is to sail fast, that I think the priority, biggest priority is going to be pressure. So I want to be sailing where there's most wind. But for example, an offshore day, your priority could be shift. It could still be pressure, but it could be shift. Or your priority could be, oh, I always got to get to the left-hand side first because I know there's a left-hand convergence. So now we're going to go through those same sort of wind types again. Gradient onshore day. So we know it's a boat speed. Therefore, my priority is pressure. So now I am, when I'm on the water, so maybe I've launched and I'm going to think about my warm-up. I'm looking at things that will help me make decisions within that like paradigm already. So I know it's boat speed day, I know it's pressure. So I'm not really looking at tacking a lot. I'm looking at setting up my boat to go quick, and I'm looking for what indicators can I see where there's going to be more pressure. Maybe clear sky. So like we talked about in the break, clear sky, well, you can also often get puffs that come from higher up in the atmosphere. Those will typically come down in clear sky patches, and wind higher up in the atmosphere will be moving faster, and it will also be shifted a bit to the right. So puffs that come from up high, there'll be more wind, and they'll also typically be a right shift. And you can look for them, if it's sort of patchy day, they'll be coming from the clear sort of holes. So I might be looking for those as I do my warm up to confirm that this is where the pressure is coming from. I'm looking for any movement in the clouds, and I'm thinking about how to set my boat up to go fast. So it's a fast day, I'm looking for pressure. So down to the boat setup and the warm up, my goal is going to be holding lanes off the start line. I don't want to be doing a lot of tacks. I want to be going fast straight to the sides. And then maybe sort of VMG lower mode once I'm free from the start line.
When you talk about clear areas, how big does that need to be? Is it like a dominant feature in the sky, or just a little crack between?
No, little spots between clouds. So I'm thinking, when I say like clear patches in clouds, I'm thinking of days where you have clouds that are flat on the bottom and fluffy on the top, and they're sort of like spotty. I heard someone call it Simpsons weather once, because the opening scene of The Simpsons has this like blue sky with the puffy clouds, that kind of day. And on that day, the shape of those kind of clouds indicates that the air is moving up in the cloud and down on the edges. And so the clear sky patches around the edges around the clouds, that's where the air is moving downwards. So that's where I'm more likely to get these downward puffs from. So that's what I mean by like clear patches in a day. In a front kind of system, like a warm front, it will be like a distinct line, like clouds everywhere and then a line and blue sky behind it. But that's going to be less about like not looking for pressure. That's going to be a whole distinct thing moving through. So if I'm looking at clouds and pressure differences, I mean more this kind of fluffy, patchy day.
And are you going to talk separately about like outy clouds, like clouds that rain? Okay.
Yeah.
Eric has his hand up.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yes, yeah, I have a question here. You're right here, the pressure will hit the edges of the fleet first. Can you
Yes.
elaborate on that a bit, please?
Yes, totally. So typically, if you this is for an onshore day, so we have larger shifts, then the shifts are going to come from upwind, and they are going to come from both sides. So you often have the pressure sort of filling in at one angle and then filling in from the other angle and alternating like this, coming down the race course. And because the pressure comes with the wind direction, it's going to hit the like the front, but also the edge of the fleet first. So if I'm racing in a day where I think that long shifts and pressure are the most important thing, then I want to be on the edges of the fleet. I don't want to be sailing in the middle, even at the front. So my sort of an ideal strategy would be starting in such a way that I don't have to tack. So I get away from the groups. I have a fast, clear lane. And then I'm maybe doing 2 tacks on the upwind. So I'm sailing, let's say it's a little bit right shift at the start. So I'm sailing on starboard, nice lift. I just go all the way until I feel the next sort of shift and pressure come in. I tack, and then I'm going to sail all the way across to the next shift and pressure and tack around the mark. These are sort of like minimal tack days, and those pressures are going to come in from either side. So I don't mean that you should sail a knock to get to an edge. That would be a persistent shift day. But I mean that
knock is a motvrid header.
Yeah, a header. But I mean that I don't want to be attacking a lot up the middle of the fleet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, and then the other kind of onshore day we have is a sea breeze day. So it's still a boat speed day because it's onshore, but now there's probably going to be a favored side. So in the previous onshore, like just an onshore gradient, you often have winning boats from both sides. So like the first boat will come from the left and then the second boat will come relatively from the right. It really doesn't matter. It's more about who was the fastest and who got to each edge first. And then you come into the windward mark like this. Whereas on a thermal driven day, there's going to be a favored side. So that's now typically going to be the right or closer to shore. And so it's a boat speed day, but now I have to set myself up to get to that specific favored side as well. So I have a couple different questions I'm asking myself during my warm-up when I'm on the water. The first is, how developed is the sea breeze? So what time of day it is, basically. Are we in that phase where it's still building and going right? Or has it maybe hit maximum and now it's going to sort of start to peter off? Another important thing for a sea breeze day is shear. And by shear, I mean differences in wind speed sideways across the course. So on a thermal day, the wind is stronger closer to shore and weaker as it gets farther and farther out to sea. So that the wind direction could be the same across the course, but there could be more wind on one side. So like this is the sort of quite frustrating situation where maybe you're on a lift and someone else is on a lift, but they seem to be getting farther and farther to windward of you as you sail upwind, but you haven't got a knock. And that's because of this thing called shear. So you're both in an advantageous wind direction, but the person like to windward is in more wind. And so in that case, you might have to tack and get into more wind themselves. So I'm looking for that while I'm on the race course, watching the other boats. Is there shear? And that's sort of similar to the next question. Is the pressure even across the race course? Where have they set up the race course relative to these calm patches? Maybe if it's that kind of sea breeze that comes in and out. And then there may be cloud effects. But the sort of setup for the day, it's boat speed, but I need to be able to get to the right. And other people will know about getting to the right. So I need to be able to hold tight lanes. So maybe it's less about being really free, being able to go low and fast, and more about getting to the favored side. And then finally, we have offshore days. And these, again, are about sort of much more shifty days. So the wind is coming off the shore. We have these different land effects. So during the warm-up, I'm asking myself these kind of questions. I'm timing the wind shifts. So I want to know how long they are. And I'm looking to see if there's any differences in the clouds associated with the same time in the wind shift. So could I be able to predict a wind shift by the clouds moving in, or is it just sort of every 4 or 5 minutes back and forth? Or is there some kind of feature on shore like, oh, there's a building there and it seems like a lot of puffs are having to bend around this building. So I know it's going to come from this little gap in the city, for example. And then this is more that kind of day where you see these clear sky puffs. So this sort of puffy cloud pattern I talked about earlier, where then you have puffs coming down from higher up in the atmosphere. So I'm also looking for those kind of clouds. And then the setup for this kind of day is that I'm trying to get to the next shift or get to the next pressure. So I'm less worried about height, and I'm more worried about getting myself to be the first one into the next puff. So this is where I talk a little bit about the different kinds of clouds. So this is, again, this typical offshore days where we have more shifty, sort of puffy kind of day. And the type of cloud can really indicate the timing or the type of shift. So these small cumulus clouds, these puffy clouds with flat bottoms I was talking about earlier, where they're relatively close together, they've got clear patches in between. These are going to be shorter shifts, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So you get 3 or 4 of them in an upwind. And there's going to be more wind coming from the sunny patches, from the clear skies. The wind is coming down. Bigger, farther apart clouds. So less this sort of like patchy, puffy clouds all across the sky, but maybe there's just like one big cloud developing over a bit of land or something moving in. These are going to be longer puffs. So this is also maybe when you have a stronger breeze kind of day, and the puffs are going to be longer. So they might stay for an entire upwind. It's just a righty, the whole upwind. And these are also irregular shifts. So a cloud might move in and cause a shift for a whole upwind, and then move past the race course, and it goes back to the normal direction. Yeah, Anders?
Yes, when looking at the clouds, are they directly above you, or is it a specific angle that you're looking at? Or is
yeah, great question. So I am looking for clouds basically anywhere from sort of side to me and upwind, but usually not directly above me. So these kind of like puffy cumulus clouds, the first type, directly underneath the cloud, there will be less wind. So you actually want to be sailing on the edges in the sunny patches. In the most extreme versions of this kind of day, which I've sailed only a few times in some kind of like tropical places, I was literally trying to sail in the sun because the sun was almost directly overhead. And so there were shadows underneath the clouds, and in the shadows was less wind because it was under the clouds. So you try to sail in the sunny patches. So in that case, you want to be more in the clear sky and not have the cloud directly above you. This is usually the same thing for these bigger, farther apart clouds. It's more about what the cloud will be sort of pushing the wind in front of it. You can think of it that way. So I want to be looking upwind and see what cloud is moving towards me. And that will typically bring the wind. Once the cloud gets over top of the race course, that's not necessarily a good thing, because you might have a lot of like vertical mixing, and it could kill the breeze or cause some strange shifts. So you're more looking upwind for the things that are moving towards you than stuff that's directly above your head.
And are you looking more up gradient wind, like up in the direction that the clouds are coming from? Because sometimes that's usually not the exact same direction as the race course wind.
Yeah, so in the directions the clouds are coming from, exactly. Like the race course wind might be a little bit more left of that, but generally sort of upwind and where the clouds are coming from. The one caveat is these like fully raining clouds. So these puffy clouds that are not raining that I talked about earlier, it's very light wind underneath them because the air is moving upwards there. So that's not really good for us at the surface because it's just sort of going away. But clouds that are raining, and the rain doesn't have to reach the surface. So it's clouds that have sort of like, they're fuzzy at the bottom, which is usually rain coming out and then it's just evaporating before it gets to the surface, or it's raining all the way. So clouds that have stuff coming out of the bottom. These kind of clouds have air coming down typically out of them. And so those clouds can cause more wind as you sail towards and into them. Especially rain clouds in the northern hemisphere that come from the right. So if you're sailing on like a bigger lake or something and you see a rainy these are typically dark gray clouds coming from the right, that's an almost surefire sign that that cloud is going to bring wind, more pressure, and shift from the cloud. So in that case, you always want to sail towards it. And there will be wind basically all the way up until it's really on top of you. Maybe behind the cloud, those kind of clouds, there won't be as much wind, but they're large enough that that's maybe not such a thing. So if the cloud looks like stuff's coming out of the bottom, then it's good to be under the cloud. If the cloud looks like it's flat on the bottom, then it's bad to be under the cloud. Okay. So the next level of my decision making, once I know my priority, and I'm getting closer and closer to the race time as I'm thinking through this, is now start positioning. So the same example we had before, it's gradient wind, it's onshore, so I know it's a boat speed day, so I know that the priority is pressure. And so my starting strategy is going to be setting myself up for a clear lane, excuse me, and being able to go fast. And I don't really mind where on the line I am, because like I said, both edges tend to come in on these onshore gradient days. So I just want to be the first one that's fastest out to an edge. So it doesn't really matter which part of the start line I'm going to be on. That means that I can start relatively away from maybe big clumps of boats or people that I know are going to mess me up. And I can prioritize being able to get away from the start line as fast as possible. So now I'm sort of talking through these start decision making. So onshore starting, like I said, if it's boat speeds and edges, then this kind of day, the starts are a huge part of the race. So like I said, I am maybe doing only 2 tacks in this kind of upwind. So I really don't want to be having to tack a lot after the start, being mixed up with other boats or scrambling. I want to be able to escape from the other boats as quickly as possible. So the starts are going to become a very, very key part of the race for me. And so I am really prioritizing getting off the start line cleanly. And it doesn't really matter where on the start line that happens. On a sort of steadier, pressure-driven onshore day, there's not a lot of opportunities on the race course to make up for a bad start or for sailing in dirty air, because it's not very shifty, and there's not big changes across the race course. So the front line boats that get off the start line are going to be more likely to come up to the windward mark first. If it's sea breeze day, so it's still a boat speed day, but the priority is now getting to a favored side. Now I do have to think about a favored end. I still don't want to be doing a lot of tacks. It's a boat speed day, but I want to be getting to the favored side of the course. So I need to be starting on the side that allows that. So for example, if it's a left side of the race course is the favored side, then my starting strategy is how do I hold a lane on starboard? How do I have fast acceleration, and how do I clear the boats around me? So I'm trying to roll the boat to leeward, I'm trying to pinch out the boat to windward so that I have a clear lane on starboard. I'm probably starting closer to the pin and thinking about going low and fast. If it's a right-hand side favored day, then I want to tack quickly into a good lane. So winning the race committee or being very close to the boat end is the best start. And I want to be thinking about my approach to the starboard ley line. And then the opposite, we have offshore day. So this is all about the shifts and being on the lifted tack. So then it doesn't matter so much where I am on the start line. The most important thing is that I get onto the lifted tack right away after the start. So if the lifted tack is starboard, I want to be able to stay on starboard and have a nice clean lane. If the lifted tack is on port, I want to set myself up so that I can tack right away. I don't have to wait for a lot of other boats. So that's going to more dictate where I start on the line, which shift I want to get onto, and also where the next pressure is coming from. So if you've been timing the shifts and you know they're maybe 3 minutes long, and it's been a right shift for most of the start sequence, then people setting up for it to still be a right shift at go might be a bit late. You know that the right shift is almost over and it's going to be left the next time. So you want to set yourself up so that you can get onto port right away and you're hitting the new shift first. So a good start on an offshore day is all about being able to make your own decisions and being the first one onto the correct move. Well, ideally forcing other people onto the wrong move. Okay, and then I have, I think just one final slide where I sort of talk about the difference in a tactical versus a strategic day. So I previously were dividing up the days based on the sort of direction and type of the wind, but you can also think about a day that's more about boat on boat tactics or a day that's more about large scale strategy decisions. So like a shifty offshore day or a shorter race course, or the kind of racing that we are often doing Wednesday nights out here might be, well, actually maybe not those super long like lap ones, but the like when we do like 5 or 6 races in a night, that might be a more tactical day. So it's less about the like large scale things that are going on, and it's more about boat on boat maneuvers. And so I'm looking for the kind of like weather indicators that are quick, short things that allow me to position myself advantageously to other boats. So I'm looking for the lifted tack. I'm looking to have the ability to make decisions, sort of I can tack when I want, and I'm forcing other boats away rather than other boats dictating my racing. I want to be the one trying to force other boats onto the knock. Versus a strategic day. So maybe it's these larger weather patterns rolling through. or a longer race course where we have like more large scale decisions in play, then ideally we're using the sort of like ideas about the weather to make a strategic plan before the race even starts, so that you can put your mental energy more into making the boat go fast and getting rid of the few other boats around you than about worrying what's happening with the weather. So if you've already made the decision, like, I think it's a persistent shift to the left, I'm going to set myself up for that, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. You have your whole plan from, you know, the start through the race course set up, and it sort of simplifies your decision making. So on those sort of like persistent days, it's more about being fast and picking the right strategy than it is about these sort of like tacking battles and forcing boats either way. Okay, so in summary, I basically hope that you learned a little bit about different kinds of wind and weather and how it can impact your decision making and your setup for a race day. And ultimately, having a good understanding of the weather can make our strategic planning a little bit easier and also give you confidence in your decision making. So if you go somewhere with a sort of nice thermal development and you understand what that kind of day looks like, then you can go on the water confident that you have a good idea of what's going to happen in the day. You don't have to spend a lot of mental energy worrying about the shifting wind conditions. And instead you can, you know, think about all the other crazy stuff that goes on in a laser race. So this is sort of the step-by-step process that I would go through. I'd first look at the forecast and figure out the gradient wind. I'd decide on the type of day, onshore or offshore, and what the angles are and the shore effects. And then in the morning or on the way out to the race course, I decide on the strategic priority. So that sort of lets me know if it's about going fast or if it's about being on the lifted tack and maneuvers. And then I can make my start and my race plan according to those priorities. And then ultimately the tactics can help you execute that plan and also help you push the other boats away from what you think is the most important thing. And finally, you'll get these slides, but there's also a whole bunch of other great resources that have good weather for sailors specifically. So one thing I can recommend is Road to Gold. I think, maybe it was it ILCA Sweden or KSSS that did some Road to Gold? Anyway, it's built by Hamish Wilcox, who is a coach for Team New Zealand, and also the New Zealand Sail GP and a bunch of other amazing things. And that has a really good whole chapter on weather for racing. There's also this book called Wind Strategy, and a huge amount of the diagrams that I showed in this talk are straight from that book. It's really detailed and great. And then there's some links to the UK Met Office, and I'll try to find a similar thing in Swedish from SMHI for like how to read a weather map. And yeah, I think that's it. So if you have any questions, I think we've got half an hour or so. And if not, thank you so much for listening. And I know it was a long talk, but I hope you got something useful out of it.
Got a hand up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just clapping. Thank you for the talk. It was really nice. I definitely will will have to I will have to go through the go to the slides again. It's a lot to digest.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's totally a lot, no problem. I'll make sure Ian sends them out. And like even I you know, when I'm looking at like if I'm planning for a regatta or like on a race day, we'll like remind myself of these things and I have them written down and whatnot. So it's not like it's a lot of information for sure.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
In your experience, how are the other sailors thinking much about these things when they're planning the races? Or
Yeah, I think they are. At least either the sailor or the coach. So a lot of the time, so like when I am sailing at like a sort of World Cup level event, most people have their own coach, or the team has a coach for a very few number of sailors. And I would say a lot of this kind of thinking often falls on the coach's shoulders. So looking at the weather forecast, trying to figure out the type of day, trying to figure out if what's going to happen or whatnot. Often the coach is doing this kind of thinking, but the reason for that is more or less the same, is that they want to take away too much unnecessary thoughts from their athlete, right? So if the coach can figure out the kind of day and just say, well, look for this kind of cloud, it's probably going to be the puff. Great. The sailor doesn't then have to, the sailor's mind is freed up to worry about all the other little sort of like maneuvers. So I think a lot of people are are thinking about the same kind of thing. And I think that's, or at least for me, that's the great advantage of being able to understand the weather type and how it impacts the day, is that I just, it makes the decision making easy. You know, so if I go out on the water and I think, oh, it's going to be a sea breeze day, I'm going to look for the right shift. First race is at 1 p.m. So it's still building. I'm just going to start and go right. Done. Easy. When I get onto the race course, now all I have to worry about is setting my boat up.
Is actually doing it.
Yeah, but then I can think about like, okay, well, how does it feel fast to go through the waves today? And what kind of settings do I want? And I can also be very confident, right? Like, I know I'm going to start here and I'm going to go right. Easy. I'm not one of, I really think that confidence leads you to sail in a more sort of like, I don't know, when I don't know what's going on and I'm unconfident, I end up tacking a lot. I end up in the middle. My coach is like, oh, I saw you and you were in the middle of the fleet, and then sort of, we call it the cone of death, right underneath the mark, and I'm tacking back and forth. I'm losing boats from either side. And that's usually races where I haven't made a good decision, or I don't know what's going on, versus races where I feel confident and I've made a clear choice. Even if it's the wrong choice, it's much easier when you've like committed distinctly to a strategy, I think. So.
I had a question. If you could go back to I think you had a picture of yourself in Villa Maura. Yeah.
All the pictures are of me.
Well, I think you've almost gone past it there.
Like this starting one?
Yeah. And I was just sort of thinking, what does that looks like a difficult, not obvious to me what would be going on in the atmosphere. Sometimes it's a bit gray and indistinct. Are you looking for the foreground clouds or trying to pick out some shades? What do you see from that picture?
Yeah, that's a cool question. Let me zoom in. So I will caveat by saying,
do you remember?
I remember this regatta, but I don't know if I remember this day, but that's even more interesting. So we can try to figure out what I know just from looking at this picture. So first thing, it's those cliffs are coming out of the marina and a bit to the right. So that's like a pretty straight shore. So the wind is like onshore a bit right. This could be the end of a thermal day. So Villa Maura gets a lot of thermals. So like a slightly right onshore breeze could be like a thermal sea breeze day. There's like gray sky back there, but there's also some puffy clouds. So it's possibly a thermal day. I've started like mid to right boat, which kind of indicates, and there's a lot of boats right next to the committee boat on the right. So that also kind of indicates to me that maybe it's this persistent right day, which also maybe means that it's a thermal or like a thermal day. And so if that's the case, then it's about getting to the right-hand side of the race course. And it's about watching it for shear and looking for pressure. So if it's that kind of day, then I want to start close-ish to the boat. So for me, I don't want to start right in this clump because my odds are not good of having a great start. So I'm that can 217.396. So I've started just below this clump. So I have a nice clean big lane. And my goal is to try to sail fast and thinking about when I want to get to the starboard ley line. So I bet most of those boats will tack early. I'm going to try to tack on their hip. And then depending on how that goes, I'm either maybe ducking and tacking on the starboard ley line or leading back from that starboard group and going up closer to the mark, depending on how quickly we get to like the right hand shift. That's what I think is happening on this day. Yeah. So then I've already made the choice that it's about getting to right hand side, about sailing fast. So I'm not really too worried. I'm not actually looking for clouds or anything. I know that the strategy is decided, and I'm just thinking about how I play it with the other boats. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think I tend to look more at the water to see where the puffs are coming, but maybe I should look more at the clouds. Or am I too late in my decisions when I look at the water? It's already happened then.
I don't think so. I think you can look, like the water is also a good place to look. It depends. Sometimes it's hard to see on the water if the light is in a certain angle or there's a lot of glare. Then maybe it's easier to look at the clouds, but also you can totally look upwind, especially before the start. So I like to like sort of be maybe 100 meters above the start line and then stand up in my boat. And then it's even just a few feet higher, you can see down onto the water a lot better. And then it's all about looking for those darker patches that are typically puffs. And so in this kind of like onshore longer shift day, I'd be looking to the very edges of, like, as far upwind as I could, to the edges of the race course, and basically seeing which side looks darker. So typically it'll be like one side or the other coming in and out, and I'm looking for that dark patch. So yeah, absolutely, looking at the water is also great. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't know if I had any extra. Oh yeah. I've made a couple of extra, I made too many slides because there's so much fun stuff to talk about with weather and sailing. So this will all be sent with Ian, of course, but this is a good example of some of the those sort of like upper level puffs we talked about earlier, where they're coming from high up and they're spreading out as they hit the water. And this diagram shows like this is the sort of puff you might look more at the water for. And so in this kind of like puffy offshore day, you want to be connecting the puffs. And so they've shown this kind of tack or this boat path here, where the boat is trying to sail from puff to puff to puff. So that's where they've chosen to go up the race course, connecting those sort of paws coming down. And those will be typically coming a little bit more from the right than the mean wind direction. So you might want to get across to them and then sail under. Yeah, the other thing with these is that they spread out as they hit the water. So you can sail around the edges of them and get a little bit of a lift too, which is what those arrows are trying to indicate.
You wouldn't expect this for a bigger, like
no, this is the small patchy puff kind of day. These you can see really easily on the water. They really do look like this sort of little cat's paw, they call them. You know, when a cat touches down and its toes spread out, it looks just like this on the surface.
If you've got some cat's paws, like you've noticed that effect on the water, would that indicate that it's probably only that, or could you still have wind lines come through?
You could still have wind lines. Yeah, you have to, these would be more close to you and you'd be looking farther ahead for wind lines, but these are also on these kind of well mixed days.
So it's a pretty turbulent atmosphere all around.
Exactly, very turbulent. Yeah. Cool.
If you had a lot of extra slides and we don't have many questions, then I wouldn't mind you to go through them.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I only have 4, so that actually works out pretty well.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm also,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm also a bit slow, so I need to adjust this for a couple of days, and then I might have a couple of questions. But
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure Ian sends out my email. So if there's something that comes up, like after you've digested, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm super happy to chat about weather and sailing at any time. So
very nice.
yeah, that's definitely open. Okay, so what other slides did I have? Oh, this is, yeah, this is a bit more like of the sort of thought process like I talked about before. Maybe that's not so helpful, but then I had some specifically about tactics. So there's this one with connecting these sort of small puffs from high up. Then there's, oh, this is quite an interesting way, like thing that weather can help with your decision making. So this is like when to tack when you hit a puff, depending on the type of day. So or when you hit a shift, sorry. So if it's offshore day, where the puffs, like it's very shifty and the puffs are short, so the pressure doesn't last for a very long time. Then when you hit a shift, so you're sailing along and you get knocked, you want to tack right away. The shifts don't last very long and the pressure is kind of moving through quite quickly. So as soon as it hits you, it's there and you want to take advantage of it for as long as it's available, because the shifts of pressure are short. Whereas a more steady day, an onshore day, or like longer shifts where they're either persistent or maybe there's only 1 or 2 shifts per upwind, then you want to tack right away again. So the shift gets to you, you don't want to be sailing on a knock, you want to tack into it and sail the long lift. Versus a day where you have maybe a thermal or a side shore breeze somewhere where there's a persistent shift. So a persistent shift means that it's always turning that way. So like this kind of left bend because of the shore or a right bend because of a thermal. These kind of days, you actually want to dig in a little bit. So when you first get the knock, it may not be as steady, or it may be that you want to take more advantage, you want to take more leverage or dig into the shift a little bit before you tack. And so on these kind of days, you want to make sure you don't, for example, sail to the pressure or let other people get into more pressure because you tacked early. So this is another way you can sort of set up your decision making for the kind of day. If it's offshore and puffy, I get knocked, attack, I get knocked, attack, I get knocked, attack. So again, you already don't have to think about it. That decision process has been made for you. Versus a persistent shift or a wind bend day, or especially a wind shear day, you get knocked, you think, interesting,
Is this
maybe
real?
I should tack, but you wait a little bit. You see what the other boat's doing, you wait a little bit, and then you tack when you make sure that you're really in the pressure, and then you're really into the full strategic advantage of the priority shift. So this is a good way, the type of day can sort of like dictate the way that you make decisions. This is another kind of like land effect. So this actually might happen. I wonder if this happens at Malahöjden sometimes when the wind is like along the longer part of the channel, not the narrow bit by Olsten. Anyway, this might happen there, but it's sort of this channel effect. So if you have, if you're sailing in more like a long channel with like land on either side or relatively narrow piece of water, then you can get a convergence effect in the middle. So that means that there's going to be stronger wind in the middle of the channel and lighter wind on either sides. And the interesting thing about this kind of day is that then the inside boat controls the situation. So on a persistent shift day, it's the boat that's farther towards the shift, the outside boat, they're going to have the big advantage. But on this sort of convergence channel day, it's going to be the inside boat that has the advantage. The outside boat will be lifted, but in less wind. So this is a very frustrating place to be because you're on a lift, you don't want to tack, but you're in less pressure. So someone down here who's pointing less high will be able to sail away from you like this. And so this is one of the few kind of days where even if it's not too shifty, being in the middle, more middle of the race course and on the inside is the sort of advantageous place to be.
So that seems to be conflicting with land on the left, go left, convergent on the left side. What would cause this channel effect as opposed to?
That's a good question. So the land on the left would be for a more like open bit of water with land just on one side. Also where the breeze is coming a bit over the land as well. So it depends a bit on the gradient direction.
So this is for going straight down the channel and maybe something with high sides?
Yeah, exactly. So this is more of a channel and also something with like higher sides. So the land on the left, go left works really well for coastlines that are relatively flat. So the breeze can flow across the land without too much trouble, but there's more friction right at the surface. Whereas this kind of like channel effect, if you have mountains or even hills on either side, then there's going to be less wind, like there won't be wind coming across over the land because there's a hill in the way. So the wind will be coming down a channel, like sort of flanked on either side. If it was like a river and it was flat land on either side, then I might expect convergence in the middle and to the left. But I think typically it's a bit more like fjordish, if that makes sense. Okay, that's it. That's all my extra slides.
I have another question, but other people can jump in.
Any more, or we'll just Ian and I will just keep having a chat.
My question was about weather forecasting apps. Not all created the same. So when I'm preparing as a coach for a regatta, I'll look at as many as I can, and I have sort of prejudices against some of them, but they're fairly random or based on rumor. How can you evaluate if you have two forecasts that say different things, whether you should prepare for both or whether one's...
This is a great question. So generally, how to look at weather maps and forecasts. Let me see if the live map on the computer shows us multiple models. Maybe not. Do you know if it does?
I can't see your screen. Are you?
Oh, new share screen. Okay, so I'm on Windy app. Actually, maybe I'll share my regular screen. Share. Okay, so this is Windy. Where am I? In Africa. Okay. This is windyapp.com, which is, I use the cell phone version of this, but it's quite a good app. I just want to see if it's possible on here to change the forecast model.
Yeah, I know how to do it on the app, but...
Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Top spots. Well, let's pick a spot. What's somewhere near here?
Or you could do Gothenburg, because you made a lot of Stockholm references.
Oh yeah, we got some Gothenburg, okay. Gothenburg, Sweden. Okay. So I use Windy app on my phone. I think it's quite a good resource. They provide data from a lot of different weather models. And you can compare all the different weather models. So this is the desktop version for my laptop, which is not what I normally use, but I'll try to, it should be more or less the same. So you can take a look at, so what would I typically do, say if I was racing this weekend, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I'm gonna look first of all at, well, there's the live map. Okay, I'm gonna look at like the forecast in this kind of format. So I find it's nice to see, like you can see the wind speed, the temperature, if it's going to be cloudy or rainy or anything like that. And then ideally, I don't know how to do it on oh yeah, okay. So you can't do it on the desktop. It looks like you have to do it on your mobile. But what I like to do is compare all the different weather models. So you can see this list here. This is a list of all the different weather models that Windy app has available. And when you go on your phone, you can do a comparison. So there's this like the sort of graphic that it shows you, which will look a bit like, it'll look a bit like this, the sort of like flowing wind map that we're all familiar with. But you can also select this sort of tabular display, and then you can also look at the comparison between all the models. So a good,
Do you want to, or maybe I can show it on mine, because the EFCM and all that.
yeah, I don't know if,
No, they can't see that.
yeah, it's okay. I can share Ian's screen after and he can show you. But I think a really good thing to do is to look at a comparison in between the different models. A first order, so for what sort of model is best for what region, is you want to look for the model that is developed by that particular country or that particular region. So for us in Sweden, we can look at the forecast obviously from SMHI. We can look at ECMWF, which is the European Center for Weather Forecasting. We can look at ICON, which is a German model, but is good for Europe. And these so typically weather models are developed by a particular country or a region to serve that region. So they're better for their own country than they are for the rest of the world. So if you're traveling, you want to look for a model that's from that particular country. And then you want to look at them all compared with one another. So there will be like many rows of wind speed, like you see here in the colors, for all the different models. And that can give you a good idea of the confidence. So if all the models are showing like all orange, all the same color, then you have a good idea that that's a pretty safe prediction, because they're all predicting it. Whereas if it's a big range, the models are all predicting different wind speeds in different directions. That's a sign that it's not a very strong weather pattern. Either there's going to be just sort of like small scale local effects in play, or the weather could be changing a lot throughout that day. So it's really difficult for them to pinpoint the specific time. And so the spread in models can give you an idea about your confidence of your day. And so I think that's quite important. A lot of people miss that when they go to look at the forecast. They just look at the first map that is presented with them, and that's typically the GFS model, so you don't actually see the comparison between all these different ones. So I think that's a really good top tip when you're looking at the forecast, is see where the forecast comes from, which organization.
And for Europe, it was ECMWF
Yes.
and ICON.
Yes. And SMHI has a good for Sweden. Yeah.
And then if the others are forecasting something totally different, would you sort of throw that out, or do you just put a little question mark in the back of your head, or?
Yeah, then I put a bit of a question mark. So if the local model has something and the other ones have something completely different, that's I would put more confidence in the local model, but still I would say, there's a chance that something changes here. So then I have something in the back of my head that says, oh, look out for this certain thing that might be happening. So the forecast can also give you a hint for what's coming up. So maybe there's a front coming through, for example. It's very difficult for these kind of models to get the timing of that right. But generally you can think, oh, there's a front at some point this afternoon. So then I sail according to the morning breeze, but with the thought in the back of my mind to look for those kind of clouds or expect a change at some point, but I'm not sure the timing. That's the sort of thing that you have to look for on the water.
All right, any last questions? Maybe we call it a night. Thanks so much, Maura, for donating your time.
No problem. Thanks everybody for coming.
Very educational, I must say. Thank you.
Great,
it was
I'm glad.
really, really nice and good. Thank you so much.
Awesome, you're welcome.
Well, bye.
All right, see you guys on the water. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Same. Hey.
Hey.